Well, good afternoon. We will call this hearing to order of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee. And I want to first thank our co-chair today and really the person who has been so laser focused on this for our caucus, and thank Senator Baldwin for bringing all of our great witnesses together today and for all of your focus and work on what's happening for families, working men and women, and what we ought to be doing for them as opposed to what we have seen happen with the tax bill. When the Republicans passed their tax bill in 2017, we were pretty sure what was going to happen, even though our colleagues on the other side of the aisle said that companies would use the billions of dollars they got from the tax cuts, give those dollars back to workers, and create more jobs. You're smiling. Yeah. Unfortunately, we as Democrats really did not think that was going to happen. Instead, we were very concerned that the money would go back to shareholders and to CEOs in the form of raising the value on stocks and stock buybacks and so on. And we've had more than a year of data now to look at this, and unfortunately that's what's happened. And we are seeing actually jobs going overseas that could have been coming here if the investments had been made here. 2018 was a record year for stock buybacks, with companies spending more than $800 billion on stock buybacks just last year alone. And in the meantime, the extra $4,000 that the Trump administration said was going to be promised to American workers in the form of pay increases. I had a big chart that I had on the floor that talked to $4,000 is what they had promised that workers would receive an extra income in terms of salary increases in addition to any tax cuts. And unfortunately, we have not seen that happen either. In fact, we're seeing right now the Trump administration traded short-term bump-ups in pay to try to make people feel last year during the election that, in fact, they were getting some kind of a tax cut or pay increase. They bumped it up for millions of tax filers who are now finding themselves owing money to the IRS, millions of people who are owing money to the IRS, and some for the first time. And they're either getting smaller refunds or no refunds. And I know in so many people I've talked to in Michigan, this is very difficult. This is money that's used to meet health care bills, to address needs for families, and all of a sudden the refund that they thought would be there is not there. And again, we're talking about millions of people. Instead of investing in new technologies, clean energy, or lowering prices for consumers, unfortunately, companies are boosting their share price, and we are seeing them spend again hundreds of billions of dollars on stock buybacks. And what we want to make sure is that workers should be getting the same deal as shareholders. In fact, in my judgment, they should be the ones that are getting the benefit of what happened. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had the executives of the top 7 major pharmaceutical companies that came before the Senate Finance Committee. So we had the top 7 CEOs with us, and they were asked how they used the tens of billions of dollars that they had received in tax cuts. And I asked, had they used any of that money to lower the price of prescription drugs? Of course, the answer was no. But what we did see is that the drug companies announced more than $73 billion in stock buybacks last year, according to the Americans for Tax Fairness. So, again, I want to thank Senator Baldwin for being laser focused on this issue and putting a bright light on this. And I want to thank all of you for coming to share your expertise and your personal experiences. We need to make sure that as we're talking about trillions of dollars having been added to the national debt as a result of this exercise in huge tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans and the biggest corporations, that we're making it very clear how wrong the priorities were in passing this. And American people, American workers, middle-class families, working families deserve a lot better. And that's what we're fighting for. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Senator Baldwin, who will take it from here.
Well, I really want to thank you, Senator Stabenow, as chair of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, for working with us to hold this hearing on such a critical set of issues. I want to give a special thanks to our witnesses today, who I think are, well, experts in your fields and experienced in the consequences of the explosion we've seen in stock buybacks and the consequences of not having a stronger voice for workers in the decision-making process at corporations. And so we're here today to discuss the impact of stock buybacks on our entire economy, and how we must reward work by giving workers a say in how company profits are spent. American workers have consistently delivered productivity gains and profits for their companies. But instead of being rewarded for this by seeing increases in their wages or salaries, corporations have often spent profits that their workers have helped create on stock buybacks, and the stock buybacks, which in turn lead to enrich those who are compensated in part through stocks, as well as obviously those who experience benefit from what may be a temporary rise in stock price. Corporate spending on stock buybacks, as Senator Stabenow has just shared, has grown in recent years, but it exploded after the Republican partisan tax legislation became law. President Trump said that these tax cuts would boost wages and boost investment. But instead, a lot of American corporations announced that they would spend in aggregate over $1 trillion on stock buybacks last year. Again, overwhelmingly benefiting corporate executives and activist investors in particular, while leaving workers and retirement savers behind, and sometimes there were also pink slips involved. And let me share an example of that from the state of Wisconsin. In my home state, shortly after the tax measure passed into law, Kimberly-Clark Corporation announced that it had made over $3 billion in profits in 2017. Instead of then understanding that they would have new permanent tax breaks moving forward, instead of deciding to reinvest that in their workers, Kimberly-Clark instead increased its stock buybacks to roughly $900 million and announced the impending closure of 2 major manufacturing facilities in Wisconsin. And this would have resulted in laying off hundreds of workers in the Fox Valley of our state. I had a chance to meet with a few of the workers following that announcement. And the story, there were so many stories I remember hearing, but the one I remember most was that in January of 2018, employees at the facility were gathered in a large conference meeting room and told that they were really the flagship facility for the Kimberly-Clark Corporation, that they had met all of the goals in that facility, and they were praised for their hard work and the exemplary way in which they were doing their jobs. And then just a couple months later, the employees were gathered in that same meeting room, that same conference hall, and told that this particular facility was slated for closure. All in the year in which the tax measure was giving them the company a permanent tax break, and they had announced $900 million in stock buybacks. So let's take a closer look today at the harm buybacks and self-serving short-term corporate decision-making has on workers and the economy. Buybacks decrease investment in research and development. They can pose a systemic risk to the economy because of increasing corporate debt. Yes, corporations take out loans in order to do stock buybacks also. Contrary to what buyback defenders will tell you, research shows that while buybacks can prevent a short-term stock price increase, they actually decrease shareholder wealth over the long run, harming retirement savers. As a result of these trends, income inequality is now at levels last seen immediately preceding the Great Depression. Stock buybacks exacerbate inequality by enriching CEOs, other top executives, and activist hedge funds while shortchanging worker pay. Not only is income inequality bad for workers and morally wrong, researchers at the Economic Policy Institute found that it slows GDP growth by 2 to 4% annually. We've established that buybacks harm workers and our long-term prosperity. So what could change the equation to allow workers to share in the profits they help create? Research has shown that countries with less income inequality have higher levels of worker representation on their company boards. By giving workers a seat at the table, we can ensure that corporate profits are more likely to be shared with workers who actually create them. This reform could make our economy grow faster and much more equitably. I believe that ending the corporate buyback binge and giving workers a seat at the table will ensure that workers share in the prosperity that they help to create. That is why tomorrow I'm reintroducing the Reward Work Act, which will require at least 1/3 of corporate boards be directly elected by workers. The Reward Work Act will also ban open market stock buybacks. No longer will executives and activist investors be allowed to use buybacks to enrich themselves at the expense of workers and long-term retirement savers. By making corporate leadership accountable to workers, the Reward Work Act will ensure that our economy creates broad and sustainable prosperity. I look forward to discussing this legislation with and the broader problems with stock buybacks and the promise that giving workers a seat at the table holds for workers today at this very hearing. But before I ask the witnesses to make their opening statements, it may be useful for me to provide some context. While the buyback binge was exacerbated by this partisan Republican tax bill, this problem has been festering for decades. The SEC's ill-fated 1982 rule, 10b-18, opened the floodgates by providing executives and board of directors a free pass to manipulate their stock prices through buybacks. Institutional investors whose compensation is tied to the short-term stock price performance pushed for executives to be paid the same way. Thus aligned, executives and Wall Street present a unified front against retirement savers and workers who commit resources to the company over the long term. Today, buybacks are so common that questioning them can almost seem heretical. I hope that today's discussion will address some of the most dubious arguments that I've read, that buybacks always boost share prices over the long term, that buyback proceeds are reinvested into more productive businesses, or that retirement savers prefer buybacks to dividends. I look forward to hearing all of your testimony. I want to welcome my colleague, Senator Hirono, who has joined us, and I'm just going to quickly introduce the witnesses so that, and then we'll ultimately begin with you, Mr. William Lazanik. Mr. Lazanik is an emeritus professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and president of the Academic Industry Research Network. In studying the social foundations of stable and equitable economic growth, he has become a leading critic of the role of stock buybacks as a source of employment instability, income inequality, and sagging productivity. Cynthia Murray is a worker at Walmart in Laurel, Maryland, in the fitting department. She works 32 hours per week, and even after 17 years in her position, only makes $14.39 per hour, less than $25,000 a year. Cynthia is a founding member of the nonprofit advocacy organization Our Walmart. And recently, she filed a proposal for Walmart's upcoming annual meeting to require the company to include Walmart hourly workers as candidates to be nominated for positions on Walmart's board of directors. Stephen Sylvia is a professor of international economics, international relations, and comparative politics at American University. He researches comparative labor, employment relations, and comparative economic policy with a focus on Germany and the United States. Stephen Clifford, the author of The CEO Pay Machine, he has served as a CEO for King Broadcasting Company for 5 years, National Mobile Television for 9 years, and has been a director of 13 companies and chaired the compensation committee for both public and private companies. He holds a bachelor's degree from Columbia University and an MBA from Harvard Business School. And Joe Olson hails from Appleton, Wisconsin. He is a line technician at AT&T and president of Communication Workers of America, CWA, Local 4621. He has worked at AT&T for over 20 years. And he is currently at currently in a city where a CWA represented call center will be closing next week. Professor Lazanik, I am pleased to start with your testimony.
Okay. I thank Senator Baldwin for her courage and leadership in introducing the Reward Work Act. In according boardroom representation to employees, this legislation will make the real value creators in the nation's businesses party to the tough corporate resource allocation decisions that profoundly influence American living standards. In compelling the Security and Exchange Commission to treat open market repurchases, also known as stock buybacks, as munitions of market manipulation, the rescission of SEC Rule 10b-18 will free our economy from one of the most destructive pieces of deregulation imposed on us by the rise of Reaganomics in the early 1980s. Stock buybacks, as has been mentioned, are massive. In 2018, companies in the S&P 500 index did about $800 billion in buybacks, in addition to paying over $450 billion in dividends. For the half-decade, 2013-2017, 492 S&P 500 companies distributed $2.6 trillion to shareholders of buyback. That was 56% of their profits, and $2 trillion in dividends, another 42%, total 98%. Incentivized by their own stock-based pay and pressured by powerful hedge fund activists, senior executives have used stock buybacks to give manipulative boosts to their own company stock prices. Meanwhile, most U.S. corporate employees receive inadequate rewards for the productive labor that they perform. Senator Baldwin and her staff had paid close attention to the growing body of research that documents through detailed industry and company studies the way in which stock buybacks contributed to employment instability, income inequity, and sagging productivity in the U.S. economy. Our collective prosperity depends on investments in productive capabilities by business enterprises. The entire business sector, about 6 million firms in total, provides employment to about 81% of the U.S. civilian labor force. In 2016, within the business sector, 19,700 companies with 500 or more employees, averaging 3,400 employees per firm, accounted for 53% of all paid employees, 59% of payrolls, and 65% of revenues. So the growth of these firms and the types of employment opportunities that they provide depend on their capabilities to generate high-quality, low-cost goods and services that are competitive on product markets. And for sustained competitive advantage, a company must invest in productive capabilities, not only plant and equipment, but more important, an organization of employees who, through collective and cumulative learning, improve productivity by transforming technology and accessing markets. When successful, the value creation process that I just described yields higher productivity that shows up in the first instance as corporate profits. The financial foundation of the growth of the firm has been and remains retention of a substantial proportion of those profits on a sustained basis for reinvestment in productive capabilities. As the main value creators, the firm's employees should be the first in line to share these profits through their conversion into higher wages, superior benefits, greater employment stability, and enhanced employment opportunity. Through this productivity pay dynamic, corporate employees accumulate productive capabilities on the basis of which they can reap more rewards. This is how we get a strong middle class. Our research shows that the large-scale distribution of corporate cash as buybacks undermines the abilities and incentives of corporate executives to retain people and money in the firm, to reinvest employees' productive capabilities, and to reward employees for their work. Rather, these executives, the ones who favor buybacks, tend to downsize the labor force, pressing down wages and benefits, laying off workers, outsourcing work. And in industry like pharma, they also boost profits by price gouging. The whole point of this is to distribute inflated profits to shareholders as even more buybacks and dividends. Now, I'd like to say there's a fundamental difference between shareholders who gain from dividends and those who gain from buybacks. Dividends are paid to all shareholders, whereas the gains from buybacks done as open market repurchases go largely to those share sellers, senior executives, investment bankers, and hedge fund managers, who are in effect in the business of timing the buying and selling of shares. Under Rule 10b-18, the SEC does not require companies to report, even after the fact, the precise days on which buybacks are done. But senior executives know when the company's broker is executing a repurchase, and professional traders are able to detect this activity quite easily. Provisions of the Reward Work Act are necessary to reorient U.S. corporations to a retain and reinvest resource allocation regime that invests in productive capabilities and shares the gains with employees. To put the nation on a path to corporate governance for the common good, Congress should rescind Rule 10b-18 and place representatives on corporate boards who are able and willing to oversee value-creating investments in productive capabilities and to ensure that employees receive a far greater share of the consequent productivity gains than is currently the case. Thank you.
Before you begin, I am delighted, Leader Schumer, to have you stop by. And if you don't mind, I know your time is very limited, so if you'd like to make a statement.
Want to thank you. The bottom line is very simple. Income distribution in America is skewed out of whack. Wealth, income are agglomerating to the top. And we believe that not only government has a role to play, but corporate America has a role to play. And when 93 cents on every dollar in the last 10 years of 466 of the top Standard & Poor 500 companies go simply to dividends and buybacks, 53 cents on to buybacks, something is out of whack. We have many solutions. I believe that corporations should not. One little example. How can a corporation not fulfill its pension obligations and do buybacks. It's outrageous. And there are lots of other solutions. But what I'd say to corporate America, if you're here and listening, what are your solutions? They say, well, this isn't our job. Government should fix these things. And then so much of corporate America fights us when we try to fix these things, raising minimum wage, putting money into education, and things like that. So this is, I feel passionately about this. I am sorry I can't stay, but I thank you for doing this. And I wanted to come to show my support for DPCC having the hearing and for how important this issue is to the future of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader Schumer. Now, I would like to call on Cynthia Murray to present your testimony.
My name is Cindy Murray, and I'm from Hyattsville, Maryland. I've worked at Walmart for 19 years. Through my years of service and loyalty to the company, Walmart has failed to treat me and my coworkers with respect and dignity. This is why I helped found the nonprofit United for Respect. The reality is that 1.4 million people in America work for Walmart, but at least half of them are still part-time and relying on food stamps and Medicaid. Half of the company is owned by the billionaire Walton family. As for me, after almost 2 decades of working at Walmart, I make less than $15 an hour. This is why it makes me so mad that Walmart executives return massive profits to its shareholders through billions in buybacks. I don't mind investors making profits, but I do mind when associates like me, who have been putting in the work day after day, year after year, don't get to share in those profits, and our stores get neglected. That's why I'm here to support Senator Baldwin's legislation, which lets workers on the board to make better corporate decisions and rein in buybacks. I'm also joined here by my fellow United for Respect leaders from Sears and Kmart. We're lucky to have politicians like Senator Baldwin going to bat for all of us. I believe that Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, would have wanted us to be a part of the board. He used to say, share your profits with all your associates and treat them as partners, and together you will all perform beyond your wildest expectations. Unfortunately, his kids have abandoned his legacy. Share buybacks are a good example how corporate profits could be spent differently. Half of the $20 billion Walmart spent in share buybacks could make rich executives and investors even richer. Could have been spent on an hourly wage increase of more than $5 for 1 million Walmart associates, or on improving staffing at stores with out-of-stock shelving problems. Retail companies need to make better corporate decisions instead of squeezing workers if they want to make it. Every day, I read about a new retail company like Sears and Kmart going into bankruptcy. I read about the billion hedge fund guy and CEO, Eddie Lampert, who ruined Sears by blowing $6 billion in stock buybacks and making deals that were only good for him. We need to make it illegal for these guys to destroy our economics. If Senator Baldwin's legislation had been in place, we could have stopped this from happening. Workers on the board could have saved the company. At Walmart, our jobs depend on the company being around for the long run. We don't have billion-dollar inheritance to fall back on like the Waltons do. I can't even remember when the last time was that one of them came to any of our stores to see how we're doing. We need corporate America to value us and our work. We have expertise, loyalty, and a stake in the company's well-being. We keep the stores running well, the customers happy, and the goods selling. We want the partnership that Sam Walton talked about. We want a more democratic Walmart. This is why United for Respect leaders, Carolyn Davis, filed a resolution at Walmart this year for hourly associates to be considered for board nomination. Basically, we're demanding a say in what happens at the top because it impacts a whole bunch at the bottom. If anyone from Walmart is listening to this, I want to tell you to let us be part of how this company is run. We'll do right by everyone. And I want to thank each and every one of you for bringing this up, and it's a great opportunity, and it should be done. Thank you.
Thank you. And next, we'd like to hear from Stephen Sylvia. Professor, please begin.
I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. I would like to present a summary of the latest research on employee representation on corporate boards. In brief, cutting-edge research shows multiple benefits and no significant disadvantages for the companies, economies, and democracies that have employee representation on corporate boards. Company-level research shows that firms that have board-level employee representation have higher investment rates, are more innovative as measured by the annual number of patents secured, have higher employee training rates, are more efficient in hiring and firing decisions, have greater gender diversity on corporate boards, have a higher share of older employees, have top management compensation grounded more in long-term results, and are more committed to corporate social responsibility than those that do not. Company-level studies indicate that board-level employee representation boosts firm efficiency and market value because it improves board-level decision-making by increasing coordination and information sharing between employees and the shareholder representatives on boards. In particular, this greater information flow enhances the quality of board oversight of top managers and helps to resolve matters that might otherwise disrupt the workplace. Board-level employee representation also safeguards firms against short-sighted, opportunistic behavior by management, for example, the under-provision of training. Evidence from the 2008-2009 financial crisis shows that board-level employee representation facilitated creative and cooperative responses that enabled companies and countries with board-level employee representation to weather the economic crisis better than those without it, saving both jobs and businesses. Now, research on Germany does not show evidence of board-level employee representation contributing to wage increases. But this actually is not surprising because Germany has a separate system of collective bargaining that sets wage rates for most employees and does so principally at the sectoral level. As a result, differences between firms are not to be expected there. The impact of employee representation on corporate boards in a country like the United States, which has a decentralized system of industrial relations and a much lower rate of collective bargaining coverage, could differ significantly in this regard. Moving to an economy-wide vantage point, cross-national research shows a correlation between board-level employee representation and greater income equality as measured by a Gini coefficient. So, in summary, the latest research on board-level employee representation provides ample support for adopting the practice on economic grounds. Beyond these economic justifications for board-level employee representation, there is an equally powerful argument that the practice is inherently valuable because it expands democracy and a voice for working people. A comparison with political democracy is instructive. The point of political democracy is not to have faster growth or greater affluence, although many scholars argue that democracy is integral to achieving both those ends. We have a political democracy because we think it an inalienable right for people to have a voice in public affairs. Board-level employee representation extends that principle so that people would also have a voice in the workplace. In fact, in at least one respect, the case for board-level employee representation is even stronger than the case for political democracy. It is because people are far more familiar with their workplace than they are with the affairs of state or with the workings of government. Giving workers a greater voice in the place where many spend the majority of their waking hours is, by itself, a sufficient justification for adopting employee representation on corporate boards. I want to thank you again for this opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. And next I'll call on Mr. Stephen Clifford.
Okay. How CEOs are paid is a principal cause of the stock buybacks that Bill Lazanik has just described. Now, when I'm talking about CEOs and companies today, I'll be talking about the S&P 500. Those CEOs receive about 80% of their compensation, roughly $24 million a year, in the form of stocks and stock options. These people have a very short average tenure, 4.6 years. They're going to be cashing out very soon. They have a very, very high incentive to keep the stock price high. Now, the quick and easy way to do this is to buy back your own stock. So what we've got is a pay system that motivates corporate America to eat the seed corn. It's really insane. And this is just one element of what I call the CEO pay machine, which is a set of pay practices that executive comp consultants developed in the 80s and 90s. Now, the first thing you have to realize is this system has nothing to do with free markets. These guys love free markets except when it comes to setting their own pay. Then they just ignore the markets completely. Because CEOs are, it's not set by supply and demand. These are not like LeBron James, who could go to any team and improve that team immediately. Most CEOs would not improve another company. The reason is they don't know much about that other company. Therefore, 75% of all new CEOs are internal promotions who've worked 12 years and understand the company. When you hire from the outside, they usually fail. They're more than twice as likely to be fired as an internal hire. And companies understand this. That's why they don't bid against each other for CEOs. They don't raid CEOs. Less than 2% of all new CEOs were previously the CEO of another public company. So without a market to guide them, what's happened is they have built this system, this insane system called the pay machine that just annually escalates CEO pay as you go through the interactive steps of it. It's a very complicated system. And it's raised CEO pay by 1,000% over the last 10 years, while the average worker's pay has not risen at all. Now, numerous studies have shown that this system doesn't correlate pay with performance. It doesn't align CEOs with shareholders. In fact, channels CEOs' energies in the wrong way. Very, very short-term time horizon. Yet corporate boards never even question the system's effectiveness. And, you know, I wonder if the real cost of, say, insurance had risen 1,000% in the last 30 years, based on some consultants' recommendations, somebody on the board would say, why don't we fire these clowns and, you know, get rid of the system? But no board member says that today. They want to keep the CEO happy. He's the captain of the team. He's often their friend. CEOs and ex-CEOs are the majority of most of these boards, so they're happy to see this in place. Director and CEO compensation is highly correlated, so they're kind of happy to see this in place. You're not going to be asked to join another board if you're noted as a hawk on CEO pay. And finally, you can reassure yourself that, hey, I'm just doing what everybody else is doing. This is how pay is set in America. We all have this pay machine that's been designed by these brilliant consultants. Now, I'm a believer in capitalism and free markets. And my career has been in capitalism and free markets. I'm a critic of CEO pay because it has nothing to do with free markets. And it harms capitalism. It harms the companies that use it, and it harms the economy, as well as harming the employees. It impedes economic growth, and it also fuels the growth in income inequality. So, you know, when CEOs and corporate neglectors really flagrantly neglect their fiduciary duties, and that's what they're doing. This is money that mostly should go to the shareholders, some should go to the employees, and hundreds of millions of dollars are going to, and it's flagrant neglect of their duties. it's time for somebody to step in, and government's the only, only people that can do it. Thank you.
Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Joe Olson for his testimony.
Good afternoon, Senator Baldwin and all the senators here today. Thank you so much for holding these important hearing and for the opportunity to testify. My name is Joe Olson. I am the president of the Communication Workers of America, Local 4621, and I am an outside technician handling business services for AT&T. I have now worked for AT&T for nearly 20 years, since I have left an electrical apprenticeship and began working there as a lineman. I then went on to oversee the line work, later to become a cable splicer, then a fiber splicer, then an electronic installer, and now I install fiber optic services for businesses in and around Appleton, Wisconsin, where I live with my beautiful wife and lovely daughters. This work has often been challenging and stressful, but it has been very rewarding for me, especially with our union contract. This job allows me to make a decent living, provide for my family, and will hopefully allow me to put each of my daughters through college one day. And on a day-to-day basis, I am providing important services and businesses in our region to help them grow and create more good jobs. Unfortunately, many of our coworkers have not been so lucky. This Thursday, AT&T will be closing its call center in Appleton, Wisconsin, putting over 20 of my colleagues out of work. This call center has been shrinking for years now, as there were almost 400 workers at this call center just a decade ago. You can imagine what the loss of 400 good jobs has done to a pretty small community like Appleton. Next week, 5 of our premise technicians will also be let go, out of 13 overall in the state of Wisconsin. 2 years ago, Appleton had 48 premise technicians and will soon only have 17 left. Across the country, AT&T has cut more than 12,000 jobs over the last year. That's partly due to failures investing in growing our company and our customer base. And it's partly due to the outsourcing and the offshoring of jobs. At the same time that our call center in Appleton and others across the country are closing, we now at AT&T has opened 2 call centers in Mexico, one in Mexico City and one in Guadalajara, that employ 2,475 people today and continue to grow. These are not third-party contractors. This is AT&T itself setting up in Mexico to more easily exploit and underpay workers who serve U.S. consumers. That's happened despite the fact that our CEO loudly promised that our company would create at least 7,000 jobs if the corporate tax cut passed. Our company and executives are beginning to richly reward by the tax cut to the tune of about $3 billion per year. But unfortunately, they have not passed those benefits on to workers. That's actually only the beginning of the problem. AT&T also cut its capital expenditures by $250 million last year compared to 2017. That's after promising to increase of $1 billion to invest during the rush to pass the tax cut bill. Failing to invest in building out our infrastructure likely means that even fewer jobs going forward. In fact, I and 14,000 of my coworkers have been working under an expired contract for nearly a year because AT&T refuses to improve job security language to ensure that these kinds of cuts won't continue to happen. So if AT&T has been cutting jobs, what has it used its tax windfall for? In part, stock buybacks to help boost the short-term and share price and reward company executives who are paid largely in stock awards. Last year, AT&T conducted $609 million in stock buybacks, and the highest level of buybacks that the company has done since 2014. That money alone could have funded 6,625 jobs. Since 2013, AT&T has actually conducted a total of $16.5 billion in stock buybacks. So it is no wonder that the company has failed to invest in creating jobs and building out the technology infrastructure that is needed for the 21st century economy. I am not seeking to make tens of millions of dollars per year like our CEO and so many other CEOs. Like I said, I simply want to keep good working jobs that I am proud of, take care of my family, and put my daughters through college someday. But all of that is jeopardized when the company like AT&T are allowed to spend their extra resources on buying back stock and manipulating the stock price and benefit executives, rather than investing in workers and building out our company to be ready to take on the challenges of the future. For too long, corporate executives like those at AT&T have decided to prioritize making their short-term share price as high as possible instead of helping the workers who have built the backbone of the company. I urge Congress to stop these malicious stock buybacks and help create jobs to benefit the community like mine, Appleton, Wisconsin. Thank you much.
Thank you. Oh, I appreciate all of your testimonies. This is it's really helping connect the dots. I think we often hear these stories in isolated fashion, and people don't see what's happened over the course of decades. But I think the explosion in stock buybacks and the decision-making of corporate boards on how to use the windfall they've received because of the tax bill has helped us shine a light, as have all of you in your testimony. I have some questions, and I want to start with some questions for you, Professor Lazanik. You have been, through your academic career, a leading sort of analyst and now critic of stock buybacks. You have touched on this already in your opening statement, but can you explain in particular how hedge fund activists and corporate executives use the buybacks to enrich themselves at the expense of workers, and sort of just walk us through the steps?
Okay, so the first step is, as I said before, we have to understand that profits, when a company is profitable, that is what allows it to grow. And you need the productivity of your employees. You need to be producing new products for the future. So you need to do something which I've called retain and reinvest. Mm-hmm. You need to retain the people, reinvest the money, and have those competitive products to produce in the future. And if you're successful, the workers are going to have a lot to do with it. Okay, now when those profits appear, however, some people may say, well, no, those don't belong to workers, they belong to us. Now, I actually witnessed the change in that ideology in the 1980s. I was at Harvard Business School. I had been in Harvard Economics Department for a long time before that. No one was actually coming into the 1980s talking about shareholder value ideology. It was basically a stakeholder view of the company. And even at Harvard Business School, I was a research fellow from 1984 to 1986. No one was talking about that in 1984. But then they hired a guy named Michael Jensen, who was the guru of maximizing shareholder value, came from the University of Chicago, had all this down pat in terms of what economists argue. And I come from economics. I could tell right away that this had nothing to do with what companies should be doing. And it went on from there. And unfortunately, that's still what's being taught in business schools and economics departments and what's believed in boardrooms. And what they don't recognize is this need to invest in companies. It seems totally apparent to anybody who understands a company, but they do not understand the company. So having adopted this ideology, then when these companies are successful, there's this pot of gold, basically, and I think Stephen Clifford has, explained how this works. But basically, the way stock options and stock awards are structured is you get the stock price up, and you cash in, and you get the realized gains. So for executives, that's the way. You could structure even stock options in a different way. You could have all kinds of performance requirements, et cetera, but they're not. Okay, so it's structured in a way that you get the stock price up, you get the gains. I think hedge fund activists we have to pay a lot more attention to them, because they're actually a very small number of people who are hugely wealthy, hugely influential politically, and particularly these hedge fund managers who go into companies and rip them apart. And I won't get into naming them, but we could name them, 10 of them, and we'd have some of the people who are doing the most damage to the economy. I think every executive now, whether they want to do buybacks or not, are afraid of these people. I think actually it's the only explanation for why a company like Apple has done $270 billion in buybacks in the last since 2013. I don't think it's because Tim Cook is that greedy, or I don't think it's because Al Gore, who's been on the board since 2003, likes stock buybacks. I don't know what he thinks about stock buybacks, but I think they're afraid of being attacked by hedge fund activists, and we see this over and over again. I can go in lots of cases. So this is something that we do a lot of work on and needs to be studied and needs to be stopped. And they love stock buybacks, because they get the stock price up, they dump the stock, and they make tons of money. That's how they take the money out. So you got to get the profits there, but you got to get the money out. So that's basically, and the last thing I'll say is institutional investors have become enablers of this. And they shouldn't be. It's not good for their clients, the people for whom they're trying to earn some dividend income or some retirement pay, but they've become enablers for reasons I think that were stated, that they are often evaluated by by what the market is doing in any quarter, and if they don't perform, then they'll put someone else there.
My next question sort of dovetails on this, in that it looks at more of the institutional investors, but we hear a common refrain from the financial industry that say workers with a 401k should really like buybacks because they improve returns for shareholders. Yet you recently wrote that managers of pension funds are functioning as these enablers, helping to diminish the retirement incomes of the very people they are supposed to serve. Walk us through why a retirement saver would be harmed by buybacks.
Okay. I can do with a little story. So a former student of mine, and I wrote an article in Harvard Business Review called Profits Without Prosperity, Stock Buybacks Manipulate the Market and Leave Most Americans worse off. And I can tell you that Harvard Business Review does not usually have articles with those titles, so it got a lot of attention. And a former student of mine, a very bright guy who worked for a big company, sent me an email. He said, I like stock buybacks because I have my own company share in my 401k. And I said, well, you're in your early 40s, right? And he said, yeah. So he said, well, you're not going to cash that in for 20, 30 years. So stock buybacks are not going to do you any good. You want tax-deferred dividends and to accrue, and you want the company, meanwhile, if you're going to really hold that stock for a long time, to not pay 100% out of dividends every year. You want them to be reinvesting and have some products that are going to be very different products in the future than they have now, and including investing in your own career. So he understood that, and I think that's basically what everybody who is managing a pension fund needs to understand. That you don't have people paying into pension funds if they don't have jobs, and if they don't have jobs that actually pay give them enough to save. And there is this is not an attack on shareholders, because there's a perfectly good way in which shareholders can get a yield on their savings, and that's what shareholders are. They're savers, not really investors, but there's a perfectly good way to get it, and that's through dividends. And if you're going to pay dividends, you don't want to pay 100% or 150% even of profits. You want to be reinvesting. So you want to pay dividends basically after you've done everything you need to keep that company competitive. And that's actually was the origins of dividends. That's what dividends are supposed to do. Obviously, when they start doing all the buybacks on top of dividends, they lose touch of that, even with the case of dividends. So it could be that you get rid of buybacks and they start just paying it all out in dividends. So that could be a problem too. But that's why you need the other half of this equation. That is, people on the boards who are going to say, no, that's not. We got jobs that are at stake here. And
well, I welcome
Thank
Senator
you.
Van Hollen. So I've introduced, or I shortly will be introducing, the Reward Work Act, which would ban the open market stock buybacks and require public companies to allow workers to elect their chosen representatives to 1/3 of the seats on the board of directors. I want to hear from you, Professor Lazanik, how this legislation, and you were just talking about how it works together, but how workers on the board of directors in particular will improve conditions for workers or retirement savers.
Yeah. Well, I think we've had a statement of this, that people who work every day know what's going on, and it doesn't really matter if you're employing someone who's a rocket scientist or someone who is coming in every day and making sure that the shelves are stocked. If that work isn't done, everything will grind to a halt. And I think what isn't often recognized is the extent to which people just showing up for work and knowing how to do the work is important. If anybody thinks about their own workplace, you know that's the case. I mean, you rely on people all the time. So this, and I think this notion of respect for work is very important. So that's, I think, one thing that is immediately going to be shown once you say that workers should be on boards, that we have a respect for work, which is completely gone essentially by the board in the United States. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the knowledge that workers have of what is going on, and we don't know all of what's going on in the Boeing case, although I know a lot because someone who worked with me had done a history of Boeing and Airbus, but we know they do a lot of buybacks. And I knew before we had this recent disaster that there were a lot of things that they weren't doing that they should have been paying attention to. And we can find those cases again and again and again, and they're not always as disastrous as the Boeing case. But if you had workers on boards, this would be possible that they said, no, you can't do this. We have to do this. These are the things we have to do. And then much more generally, just protect workers' interests on boards, that by having them on boards, that we wouldn't, we have this gross income inequality that is unstoppable until you have some people who have an interest in stopping it actually have a say in what's going on. And that's, the government can help, but it's ultimately what's going on in these companies where the distribution of income is being determined.
Thank all of you for your testimony. I'm sorry I missed the oral testimony, but actually had a chance to review much of the written testimony, so thank you for that. I want to thank Senator Baldwin and the Policy Committee with Senator Stabenow for bringing us together today, and Senator Baldwin for all your work on the issue of worker fairness, making sure that we have an economy that rewards work and not simply that gives more tax breaks to the wealthy, including, I think, this very important proposal that you introduced last year and again this year for more worker representation on boards. And it's great to have Ms. Murray from Maryland, Hyattsville, I believe. Thank all of you, and special welcome as well. So I'm sure you've covered a lot of this territory, but we're learning more every day that the Republican tax scam giveaway was based on fraudulent claims. Two big claims were that we were going to see this huge increase in investment in plant and equipment and workers. And with respect to workers, I remember on the Senate floor day after day seeing these big boards that were put up saying that there would be a $4,000 a year pay raise. And that was going to go into effect, not one-time bumps, but pay raises that would be sustained. And we have not seen those pay raises. What we have seen are these huge stock buybacks, close to $1 trillion of stock buybacks now that are overwhelmingly benefiting executives and wealthy stockholders. And there's a number of pieces of legislation introduced in that regard, which I support. There's also a narrower issue, but it's still a very important issue that relates to whether or not executives at these companies are using stock buybacks, not just to cash out, but to cash out in a way that also can be harmful to their investors. We know already they're not helping their workers. But maybe some folks who unfortunately don't care enough about workers will care that they're not taking care of their investors. Mr. Lazanik, I know you've looked at this because I have had several exchanges with folks at the SEC, including Commissioner Jackson, who's done a number of studies, including a recent one where he found that the data indicated that a lot of executives were using stock buybacks in a way to dramatically boost their own compensation at the expense of the long-term interests of their shareholders. And you were quoted in the Washington Post story about that report saying, quote, something like 2/3 of executive compensation tends to be stock-based, and, quote, executives benefit directly by boosting the share price that stock buybacks give them and selling their shares. The information they may be trading on is not transparent and is not available to the public and even to the SEC. If you could just expand on that issue a little more.
Yeah, well, it's very important, and it's actually interesting because the Jackson study, Commissioner Jackson, was actually about buyback announcements. So we actually know when companies announce buybacks, but that's not the actual buyback. So it's even worse than what he found because actually, so when the announcement is made, we all know that the company intends to buy back stock. It doesn't have to, but it intends to do $100 billion, as Apple's done over, we'll say for over 4 years or 2 years or whatever. But then they actually go and do the buybacks. And back when they adopted SEC Rule 10b-18, they didn't require that the companies report the days on which they do buybacks, even after the fact. And the reason for that was the chair of the SEC at the time, John Shad, said, well, it'd be too burdensome on companies. We've heard that before. Okay, so the SEC to this day does not know, unless it does a special investigation, when those buybacks are actually being done. So that's the material non-public information on which they're trading, not the announcements. But Microsoft, under the safe harbor, which they get from Rule 10b-18, Microsoft today might be doing, within that safe harbor, $750 million in one day, and they might do it day after day after day. We don't know, but obviously people on the inside will know. It also has to be done through one broker. That was part of Rule 10b-18, so it's easy for a hedge fund manager to figure out what the broker is doing, even if they're not giving them information, which they probably are, but even if they're not, they can figure it out. That's what they're in the business doing. So I would say there's been insider trading going on every single day since November 18th, 1982, or whenever, around this issue that has not been prosecuted. And because the information is there. So that's really what we need to get at. And it's why isn't it seen as, I think it's great that it's now, you've been raising it, and this is a really important issue. But this is 36 years since they put this safe harbor into place, and it's hardly ever been raised. And it just shows you the dominance that this kind of ideology that, well, the companies are run for shareholders, they can do what they want, the executives know what they're doing. I mean, this is one of the things I get when people talk about this. Oh, how can the executives know what they're doing? Yeah, they know what they're doing. They're getting the stock price up. Yeah, so this is a big problem. And stock awards, actually, more of the stock-based pay is stock awards, where they vest at a certain point, and it's often triggered either by hitting a total shareholder return or earnings per share target, so you get the stock price up that way, or, and Steve Clifford will know more about this than I do, but you might get 50% extra shares if you hit in the award if you hit that target. So that's the other way in which they're trying to figure out just when to do buybacks to increase their own gain, and they're doing it with information that we don't have. That's for sure.
I'm giving a 20-minute warning for when the hearing comes to a conclusion. I want to make sure I ask as many of our witnesses questions. So, Cynthia, I would love to hear. Do you prefer Cindy Murray? Okay, Cindy Murray. I want to ask you, if you are successful in your effort to bring worker representation to the Walmart corporate board, and your colleagues who are organizing in the same way in other retail contexts, what do you believe would be the outcome for workers and the overall work culture at the company? And what would you say to a critic who maintains that workers don't have the requisite background and experience required for service on the board of directors of a major corporation?
Well, I think our founder, Sam Walton, said that quite well. He said, ask your associates what they need in the store, and they can help you run your company better. I didn't say it exactly verbatim for him, but it's true. If you look at it, our hours are cut. We can't do our jobs. So when we come in, I'm almost like doing 4 or 5 people's jobs. So our stores aren't adequately, like our shelves are empty. So if we were on the board, we would know that if you give a worker 2 days a week and they don't even get 8 hours for those days, how do you run your stores? They're not ran well. They're really not looking good. But I would think we would be good, responsible, ethical directors that think about growing the company and everyone for the long run. Having a voice in corporate decision can help increase profitability of the company because workers know the stores and the customers the best. Having the board and management and the workforce working together for a unified win only makes us stronger, more competitive, and more innovative. Walmart could be a trailblazer in this issue.
Thank you. Professor Sylvia, thank you for your testimony on your research. I am releasing a report today that cites research that shows wages in the U.S. are 18 to 25% lower than wages in comparable countries that require representation on corporate boards. It also shows that companies with worker representation invest twice the amount of similar firms without worker representation. Now, given your research into companies in Germany that require worker representation on corporate boards, how do you think that the American economy would change if all companies, all publicly traded companies were required to have worker representation on their board of directors? And by the way, I appreciate your going into some detail about how the compensation in Germany differs from the system in the U.S. And so talk about the other aspects, R&D, other investments in worker training, equipment, et cetera.
Sure, thank you. One thing that I would say is just an overarching change. It would be that you would have more information flow going to board members, both employee board members and other board members, because at the moment you have a system where the CEO is in many ways the choke point of information about what's going on in the company, and is really the only source for a board. When you bring employees on, you got a second source where the CEO can say, this is working, everything's wonderful, and the employees could say, well, there are a couple areas that board members may want to take a look at where things aren't working so well. When you look at Germany, a couple things I would say. There's never been a problem in terms of an absence of expertise among employees. That was part of your earlier question, that the employees have proved to be capable board members that ask really probing and sharp questions that really improve the value of the company. So the big advantages come from this greater information flow, and information flow from a very different source. And when you look at the results, one of the things that you see with companies with board-level employee representation is you see greater gender diversity on the boards. You see more employee training that takes place in those companies. You see less income inequality. One of the things is there's a big difference between the gap between CEO pay and average pay when you compare the U.S. to Germany. In Germany, it's about 20 times the difference, whereas in the U.S., it's more like 300 times. So I think having people who aren't dependent on not getting kicked off a board because they live on boards at the table to say, and why are we paying this person so much, would make all the difference. And also asking the kinds of questions, why are we closing down this factory? Really explain to me, show me the cash flow, and explain to me why this is not a viable workplace. And we don't have people asking those questions now, but if we had employees on the board, we would.
Senator Van Hollen.
Well, thank you, and again, thank you for all your testimony. And the more I listen and look at the testimony, the more the sort of fraud of the tax cut claims becomes clear. I think we all knew at the time they were debating the tax cut that it was all pie in the sky promises. But the fact is, a lot of people out in the country believed our Republican colleagues when they said that these tax cuts that went to big corporations were going to somehow flow down to workers in the form of larger pay increases on a sustainable basis. And as I look at Ms. Murray, your testimony, I think you stated that you last year got a 22-cent per hour raise. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And when for all of witnesses, when you look across corporate America right now, we did see a lot of, one-time bonus announcements and a lot of press releases went out. But when it comes to actually fulfilling that promise of a $4,000 sort of median pay increase, that just hasn't happened, has it? And what we have seen is most corporations using this tax windfall for stock buybacks, right? Or bonuses to executives, exactly. So I'm looking forward to continuing to work with Senator Baldwin and other colleagues and all of you for how we can shape the system so that it actually helps the people who are producing the products, the workers, not those who are simply getting a big payday off of the productivity of their workers and not give anything back. And I do believe putting workers on the board would dramatically change that calculus for the reasons you've all indicated. And the disparity between CEO employee pay, it's large enough in Europe, but when you then compare it, as you just said, 20 to 1 versus 300 plus to 1, it's just outrageous. And I think it's important that taxpayers know that that's where those tax breaks went. That and increasing our national debt, which every one of those Americans is going to be paying for a long time. So they paid in two ways. One, on the national debt, and secondly, they didn't get anything that was promised to them. So appreciate your shining a light on this today. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. This is for Mr. Clifford. I've actually seen a number of instances where companies have been openly disparaged or downgraded by Wall Street analysts for choosing to invest in their workers, for choosing to reinvest in their businesses with a long-term time horizon. I've also seen activist hedge funds demand buybacks at companies that really desperately need cash to reinvest in their businesses. you've been a director at several public and public companies and served as a CEO at two. Can you share how Wall Street influences the corporate leadership's investment decisions?
Well, I'd say if activist investors are starting to circle the company, you're terrified. And the first thing you say is, how can we raise our stock price? Well, there are two ways to raise the stock price. You could do the actual hard work of product development and workforce training and new technology. It's a lot of hard work, it takes time. Or you could do the easy thing, which is buy back your own stock. So if I were a CEO of a public company and I wanted to keep my job and activist investors were circling, I would say, we're doing a big stock buyback. It's very simple. It's when you're about to be hung, you're going to do what they want. They have perfected this game. They know how it's played, and there are many examples of. Carl Icahn just got on the board of Procter & Gamble. And as soon as he got on the board of Procter & Gamble, he announced a huge buyback. You were talking about Apple earlier. Apple announced its first buyback after an activist investor did its third $500 million tranche. I mean, if you're a CEO or a board member of a company, and you're threatened with essentially a takeover, which, as we've just seen, you could lose. You're going to spend the money, and the hell with the future, because you're going to be out of a job. Right now I'm thinking of number one. I want to keep my job, and the hell with what happens 2 years or 5 years from now.
Mr. Olson, over the last decade, AT&T has spent equal to 140% of its profits on buybacks and dividend payouts. Last year, it bought $609 million of its own stock while fighting workers with demands of improved wages, but fighting to make sure that didn't happen. Moving jobs overseas, as you talked about in your testimony, and closing call centers, including the one in Appleton, Wisconsin. Tell me how you think buybacks and the closing of the call center in Wisconsin are related.
I think if AT&T was investing in its infrastructure, building out, I think of the small community of New London, which is serviced out of Appleton, Wisconsin. You look at the infrastructure that AT&T built and started with. They grabbed the metro areas for their UVerse idea, and they went with Appleton and Neenah. The build-out really pretty much didn't go much beyond that, stayed in the densely populated areas. If they were reinvesting into the corporation, into the company, and they would continue their build-out, areas like New London, Wisconsin, would have better than dial-up service. They would have better than a DSL service providing high-speed internet. Also promoting the ideas and products into a new market, a rural market, or even expanding into areas that they didn't provide this service, keeps the brand recognition up. And you would need people to then sell that product. That would keep the Appleton call center open, in my opinion. If you have the product available to sell and you're expanding your footprint and what the product you offer, you would definitely need people to sell that and provide information on it and service those customers.
Any further questions? Just for the entire panel, whoever wants to answer, I know Professor Lazanik, you have studied in particular S&P 500 companies. Is there any reason to believe that publicly traded companies not in the S&P 500 behave significantly differently? Anything you'd want to, any of you would want to draw our attention to?
Well, I think we can find lots of cases. First of all, if we look historically at any of these companies, and came out in Cindy Murray's testimony about, how did Walmart get to be so big? It wasn't always by doing stock buybacks at the beginning, and it was, these companies become successful through actually paying workers usually decently and at least better than the competition. That's usually the case, and by creating value that other companies can't create. So the problem is historical one, that then someone comes in and and says, hey, that's my money. They're eating your lunch. Okay, so that's the problem of shareholder value ideology. There are lots of ways in which companies can be protected from that. I think actually one of the reasons Warren Buffett, the reason he is one of the richest people in the world is not because he's a stock trader, although I think he's doing much more of that now. It's because he protects companies in Berkshire Hathaway from the market. Companies that where you need to have a family is retiring, or you need some management succession. They'll go to Berkshire Hathaway, and they'll be actually keep the management in place, and they'll keep the people in place, and they'll generate a lot of profits. There's a lot of worker-owned companies where we can see this works. I give lots of examples of that, and then small family-owned companies where the profits are shared. I mean, there's one called Lincoln Electric, which it's been a Harvard business case study since the 1970s. And there's a fellow, Frank Kohler, who's written a book on this, which is very good, called Spark. And he sends an email around every year. I didn't see one this year, however, about how for the 68th straight year they've shared the profits with their workers, et cetera. Well, when I didn't see it, I went and did a little research, and I found that the founder had died, and the company had started doing buybacks. And so we can see this again and again, where there's some change that takes place, where people who were actually recognizing what it takes to build a company built those companies, and we can see this with the Sears case as well. Yeah. So that's what we have to understand. It's not that these kinds of companies that share their profits with workers are a rare bird. I mean, that's what made the middle class in the United States.
Right.
Yeah, if you look at those smaller companies, you'd find a number of companies that had a single shareholder or a single family that that really controlled the stock. Those tend to think in terms of generations rather than in terms of December 31st financial results. So I think if you looked at some of the smaller companies, you'd find those, if your whole wealth is tied up in a company, you really don't care what it's worth on December 31st. You really care much more about the long term, and so I think you'd find a very different outlook in those.
Yeah, and one could say, you look at a place like Germany, and it's famous for what are called hidden champions. These are these small family-owned companies that sell, fine optics or really fantastic machine tools throughout the world. And one of the common things with them is having this system of codetermination, often having family ownership. And that's the kind of thing that made a country like Germany, the country that is very successful in a globalized world. That Germany has a tremendous export surplus because it's selling these high-end machine tools, high-end chemicals, metals, pharmaceuticals, not only to places like Brazil, India, and China, but also to other European countries and to the United States as well. So a lot of it is that respect that has built up this skilled workforce, this highly talented and engaged workforce to create these products that sell worldwide.
Well, I want to again thank our witnesses today. This has been an extraordinary hearing, and I appreciate your expertise and your hard work on these issues. Any other?
No, thank you. And thank you, Senator Baldwin. Thank you.
All right, I am going to call this hearing to a close.